So this presentation goes over the study guide that you completed last week. I want to make sure that you have the correct information. So this is the English influences on the Colonists study guide review. First, I want to make sure that you have all of your notes accessible somewhere. You should have the following notes accessible from past assignments. You should have Cornell notes on Native American cultures from presentation 1. Notes on Christopher Columbus and Spanish colonization from chapter 1 and the primary source reader and presentation 2. You should have notes from presentation 3 on the English colonies. And then you should have this study guide, which is the influence of the colonist ideas, English influence of the colonist ideas on government. So the following, again, is a review of the information you should already have on your influences on colonist views of government study guide from each other's presentation. So you should have found this information on each other's presentations. I'm just going over it again with you to make sure you have the correct information. So I go into quite a bit of detail in my answers just to make sure that you have a thorough understanding of kind of the background information. But about a 2 or 3 sentence summary of the lengthier answers or what you found on your classmate's presentation is fine. Just if what you found on your classmate's presentation is just completely off, please redo your answers so that you have the correct information. And again, just kind of summarize it with 2 or 3 sentences, what I have here. The most important thing to know, though, is how these ideas affected the colonists. So make sure that when you answer that question, that you do so thoroughly. So we're going to go over very briefly some of the history of England as it pertains to how the colonists viewed government. Now, England is a much, much longer history than the United States. We're actually a baby country compared to pretty much any other country. So I try to summarize these events and issues as concisely as I can, but it's a pretty complex history. So the first thing we're going to go over is England under the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons ruled England from 450 to 1066. So before the Anglo-Saxons ruled, it was ruled by Celtic tribes known as Celtic Britons or Ancient Britons, and they were pagan, various tribes. England and Great Britain were definitely not a thing yet. They're just various tribes that ruled independently on the islands that are now Great Britain, and there wasn't one unified government. So under the Anglo-Saxons took over England in around 450, and they united as one country known as England under King Athelstan in 927. And again, this is just England. This does not include what is now known as Great Britain, which now includes Wales, Scotland, England, and Northern Ireland. This is just that one part of Great Britain known as England. So they unite, and then under William the Conqueror would later take over with the Norman French, what is now known as France. Again, they were also not one unified country quite yet, but on the French area, they came over and invaded England and set up a new form of government under William the Conqueror. So again, just a little bit of background information there. You don't really need to have any of that memorized, but it kind of sets the stage for how English history progressed and then therefore how the colonists viewed government because they were under English rule until the U.S. Revolution. So the Anglo-Saxons established Christianity in England, and this was a big part of government. We kind of take for granted separation of church and state here in the United States, but this was definitely not the case in most of European history. The church was directly tied to the government, and the bishops, the Pope, had direct influence and rule in these various European countries. There was a strict social hierarchy with lower levels pledging an oath of loyalty or fealty to those above them. all the way up to the king. So the king was at the top, then the earls, then the thegns, then the free peasants, and then not free peasants, sometimes known as serfs. But there's a hierarchy within these different groups as well. And then there were slaves. The Normans continued to use this social hierarchy when they invaded and took over England, but with different names and positions. Except for under the Normans, under William the Conqueror, the king was a lot more powerful. So the government was organized into a hierarchy of courts as well, going all the way up to the king. Once England was established under one king, King Athelstan, in 927. So local communities of freemen, again, these rights really only applied to nobles until much later on in history, would get together and make decisions in an assembly known as a witan. And if there were any issues that were not resolved this way, then the disputes were moved up to the folk, then the leet, then the hundred, then the shire, all the way up to the king. So some historians consider this form of government to be the basis of democratic ideals, with each community able to send disputes and representatives up the ladder to resolve disputes and have their voices heard. These rights, again, only did apply to freemen, and the majority of people were not given these rights. When the Normans took over, however, the king kept the social structure but took far more power and exploited the peasants way more. So William the Conqueror really established this idea that the king was given power by God and through the church. So he actually even had conflicts with the church this way, and he took a lot of power from the church, who had previously had much more influence in the government, although we do see the church's influence on government throughout English history, and it's still really strong influence. But William took some of that power and established the idea that the king gets his authority from God, and so has authority in both government and in the church. So some of these ideas of the social structure influenced the ideas of the British, including later the colonists. So the idea of having a local approach to rule, where disputes are sent up to higher levels through appeals as needed, or where representatives represent local interests, can find their roots in this Anglo-Saxon England. Okay, so moving on a couple centuries later, we get the Magna Carta, and this is considered one of the most influential documents in history, because it's the first time that we really see an establishment of a constitution of sorts, the establishment of written rights. It's the first time in European history that there is a check on the king. So after William the Conqueror took over England in 1066, he established a monarchy with the supreme authority, with the king having virtually unlimited power, including having significant authority over the church, which was a powerful governing force in England. This had previously been under the strict control of the Pope in Rome, but we see a lot of tensions between the king and the Roman Church, kind of vying for power. Various kings from the time of William I down to King John, who was forced to sign the Magna Carta, gave various amount of rights and powers and privileges to the barons, which was the ruling nobles under the king, via various charters. So there were some attempts to check the king's power before, but this was really kind of the first solid lead in checking the king's power. It would be questioned, and on and off these powers, these rights would be given. You're going to see from this time forward a long struggle between the rights of the king and the rights of Parliament, but this is kind of the first major step. King John levied heavy taxes and enacted unsuccessful foreign policy. So he attempted to go to war with France, basically, and this angered the barons, especially when he lost. He tried to get his money that he lost in the war back, by taxing the barons that had not supported him in the war, and this made the barons very angry. So this caused the barons to enact a civil war and capture King John in 1215 and force him to sign the Magna Carta, which gave the barons certain rights and forced even the king to be subject to the rule of law. And this idea of the rule of law is the idea that the law is over everyone, including the king. There is no one person, no one group of people that is above the law, and it is a big idea in our form of government today. So who was involved? King John and the barons were involved in the creation of the Magna Carta. Really, the barons created the Magna Carta and then, forced John to sign it. But, semantics. The Magna Carta was signed in 1215. This happened in England after John was captured at Runnymede near the Thames River, which is in now Surrey. Again, you don't need to know that, but I'm trying to give you a big picture of what happened. Why did those involved feel there was a need for the Magna Carta? So the barons were angry that King John failed in his foreign policy, including a failed war with France. Furthermore, after he was defeated, he attempted to regain the money he lost by imposing taxes on the barons who had not fought with him during the war, and he did this without their approval. And this really angered the barons and was a really big theme in the American Revolution later on. This idea of being taxed without representation was a huge idea that led the colonists to revolution, and its roots can be found in the Magna Carta. This caused a civil war that led King John to be captured and forced to sign the Magna Carta by the barons. So what rights are given in the Magna Carta? These are important to know, so make sure that these are included in your notes. The Magna Carta is considered the first written constitution in European history and contains the rights given to nobles, including, again, these rights are only given to nobles, not everyone quite yet. Freedom from excessive taxes and the right not to be taxed without the consent of the barons. The due process rights and habeas corpus. Due process rights are the rights to be treated fairly in trials, not to be imprisoned, not to have fines imposed against you, not to be executed without a fair trial. And the right to habeas corpus. Habeas corpus means literally to present the body, meaning you have the right to be present at your own trial. They can't have a trial about you without you being present. So these due process rights also included the right to a trial by jury. So if you know two things about the Magna Carta, make sure you know that it established the right to not be taxed without consent and the right to trial by jury and other due process rights, other fair trial rights. But some other things, it established that the courts had to be in a fixed place. It gave the right of the church to be free from governmental influence, kind of a separation of church and state. But we wouldn't really see that fully until the United States, actually, where they completely made the government and the church not the same entity. Rights for free citizens to own property and inherit property, and the right of widows to maintain property without remarrying. So how did this influence the founding fathers' ideas on government and our rights? So this document is considered a huge catalyst for the ideas of rights, freedom, and democracy that we would later champion in the United States, that the founding fathers would later champion. They consider themselves to have these rights. The founding fathers consider themselves to have the right not to be taxed without representation, that they had the right to trial by jury, they had the right to representation. They considered themselves to be British citizens, and therefore they had these rights established in the Magna Carta. So when these rights were violated, they considered it their right to petition their grievances to the king to honor these rights. And then when those petitions were ignored, they considered that they had the right to establish a government that would honor these rights. So fast forwarding to the Petition of Rights, again, several centuries later. This is under King Charles I. Oh, I skipped that on accident. Where go over here and I'll fix the PowerPoint later. Sorry about that. Okay, so the Petition of Right was written by Parliament in 1628 and was really championed by Sir Edward Coke, particularly. He called for a revival of the rights given in the Magna Carta. So even though the Magna Carta established these rights, they were kind of on again, off again, followed by various kings throughout English history. Particularly James I of England sought to re-establish this idea of divine right. You read his plea to Parliament in the second chapter of your book called The Divine Right of Kings. So he sought to re-establish this right. There's the idea of the divine right of kings, and that continued with his son, Charles I. So Parliament sought to revive the rights given in the Magna Carta, and they objected to King James's son's policy and overreach of his authority in the violation of their civil rights. So Charles I did sign the Petition of Right to kind of reestablish some of the rights given in the Magna Carta. These rights included the rights to not be taxed without the consent of Parliament, that no English citizen could be imprisoned without cause, that no citizen could be forced to quarter soldiers or troops in their own homes, and no martial law would be imposed during peacetime. So martial law is military rule. The colonists, who were English citizens, considered these rights in this document to apply to them as well. So the reign of Charles I was after the colonies had already been established. So as we go through this history, this is running in parallel to the colonies in the Americas. Their objections to Parliament and King George's policies later on were objections to the violation of these rights. A major theme in the American Revolution is no taxation without representation. And the fact that Parliament imposed taxes on the colonists without them having representation would spark what would eventually lead to the American Revolution. So the fact that King George responded to their complaints about taxes by further violating these rights, such as sending troops to impose martial law to quell protests, and by forcing the colonists to quarter troops, only furthered the colonists' anger at their rights being violated. The violation of the rights contained in this document led to the colonists to revolution. So again, these rights, the violation of these rights found in this document led the colonists to revolution. So the overthrow of Charles II. So even though Charles I signed the Petition of Right in 1628, he decided to try to work around this little, kink in his power by just simply not calling Parliament. So yeah, sure, I'll make it so that I don't have to act without your permission, but, to get around that, I'm just not going to call Parliament ever, so I can do whatever I want, is kind of his thinking behind that. He refused to call Parliament into session so he could continue to act without their permission. And this led to conflict between Charles and Parliament, and eventually the English Civil War. It is also important to note that this conflict was also exacerbated by religious conflict, and a lot of what was going on in England at the time was religious conflict. So Charles I is Protestant, and Great Britain was officially a Protestant nation. So King Henry VIII established England as a Protestant nation. There was a brief time where, under his daughter, Mary the First, also known as Bloody Mary, she sought to remake it a Catholic nation through lots of persecuting and executing of Protestants. Then Queen Elizabeth I, again, reestablished it as a Protestant nation. And then James I, who we just read about, who signed the Magna Carta, tried to remake it as a Protestant nation, and kind of back and forth. Anyway, there's a lot of conflict between the Protestants and the Catholics during this time, but officially under Queen Elizabeth, then under James, and then now his son Charles, it is a Protestant nation, but there are still a lot of people that wanted to make it a Catholic nation. And there's also the Puritans who thought that even though it's a Protestant nation, it was still too Catholic. And so there's all of this conflict going on in the nation that kind of exacerbated this conflict between Charles I and Parliament. So King Charles seeks to restore firmly Anglicanism, or the Church of England, in England. By this time, under James, who came after Elizabeth, he was also the son of Mary, Queen of Scotland. So Scotland unites, Wales unites, and England unites to create Great Britain. But a lot of like Scotland and Ireland and those areas were still Catholic. So he sought to really establish firm control of the Church of England in Great Britain. And so he heavily persecuted anyone who fought against these ideas. And this included heavy persecution of the Puritans, who were executed and tortured because they actually thought that the Church of England was too Catholic. In fact, Charles II married a Catholic, and this further angered them. The Scottish Presbyterians also resisted King Charles trying to really establish the Church of England in Scotland. And so all of this religious tension eventually led to the threat of war. Sorry, I wish I could summarize that more concisely, but again, it's kind of a long and complicated history about the conflicts of religion in England. So this led to the threat of war, and Charles thought he would reestablish Parliament or bring back Parliament into session because he thought, well, they're going to just support me. There's a threat of war, so they're just going to come back me up. And so he reestablished Parliament and started another session of Parliament. However, they did not just back him up. They removed the Archbishop from power. They demanded that they meet at least every 3 years. And they tried to put additional checks on King Charles's power. So in order to prevent this, King Charles sought to arrest members of Parliament who went against his wishes and authority, and this led to a full-out civil war in England in 1642. So the rebel army, led by Oliver Cromwell, captured and beheaded Charles I in 1649. Cromwell ruled for a while, but divisions led to continued conflict, and when Cromwell died, Parliament put Charles II on the throne. So who was involved? Parliament and the rebels were led by Oliver Cromwell, and these were known as the Roundheads, and Charles I and those loyal to him were known as the Cavaliers, and this was the English Civil War. It is interesting to note that it's because of this conflict that the Puritans seek to go to the Americas. So the establishment of New England and the Puritan ideals up there are a direct result of this conflict and the persecution that the Puritans faced in England. So how did this affect the colonists' ideas about government? Again, long, complicated history, but what you really needed to know is that there's this long struggle between the ideal of absolutism, or the idea that the king has divine power, divine right, is the sole authority, and the democratic ideals and natural right. So the fact that England's parliament was able to overthrow a king who abused his power and establish a new king reaffirmed the idea that the people had the right to get rid of a tyrannical government and establish one that would honor their rights. This idea, the idea that people have the right to overthrow a government that abuses their power and reinstitute a new one, is found directly in the Declaration of Independence. And again, all of this is going on while the colonists are in England. So this is running parallel to colonial history. Okay, the Glorious Revolution and the creation of the English Bill of Rights. So after Charles II watches his father get beheaded, you would think that his predecessor, King James II, would be like, oh, not going to mess with Parliament and not going to override my authority, but he did. And so King James II succeeded Charles II to the throne. He was a Catholic, which again kind of just exacerbated the problem of people not liking him and not trusting him. And he also again started to try to establish more power for the monarchy and came at odds with Parliament. And this led to the Glorious Revolution. It is called the Glorious Revolution because no blood was shed. So at least this was a non-violent revolution. So that's great. Parliament removed King James I. They sieged the palace. William of Orange seized the palace, took over, removed King James without any bloodshed in the Glorious Revolution, and they put King James II's daughter, Mary II, a Protestant, and her husband, William of Orange, William III, on the throne. They were made to sign the English Bill of Rights by Parliament, which made it so the monarchy could not rule without the consent from Parliament. This was another huge step that directly influenced the colonist ideas and directly led to our own Bill of Rights. In fact, many of the rights found in our Bill of Rights can be found directly in the English Bill of Rights. So what are some of the rights given in the English Bill of Rights? So the freedom to elect Parliament without the monarchy interfering. The right to due process. Again, due process is the rights to be fairly tried with not be imprisoned, not be executed, not have fines imposed against you for crimes committed unless you have a fair trial. The rights against cruel and unusual punishment and excessive bail, that can be found directly in our Constitution, as well as the due process rights found in the 5th and 6th Amendments. No taxes without Parliament's approval. Again, this is a big deal for the colonists. They did not like that they were being taxed without their consent. Freedom of speech for Parliament. The freedom of speech, of course, is found in our Bill of Rights for all U.S. citizens. The freedom to petition the king. The right to bear arms in self-defense, again, found directly in our Bill of Rights in the 2nd Amendment. The freedom from armies being raised in peacetime. How did this influence the colonists' ideas about government? These rights can be seen directly in the U.S. Bill of Rights. These ideas are what led the colonists to rise up in rebellion in the Revolutionary War when these rights were being violated. So, governments in the colonies. So, there are various kings and queens that ruled throughout colonial history, and their approaches to ruling the colonies varied, with some kind of taking more of a laissez-faire, let them do what they wanted, with some trying to establish direct control over the colonies. So each colony's government system was different because they were established for very different reasons. We went over this in some of our colonial history under the English colonies presentation, but the Virginia Company was made to look for gold. It was an investment. And so the nobles in England sponsored people to go look for gold and try to get wealth for them. So they established a very different form of government from those in New England, who were the Puritans who sought religious freedom from the religious persecution going on in England. So some began as royal charters with crown-appointed governor, while others began as land grants with an owner-appointed governor. So nobles could buy land in the New World and establish a governor of their own. So although the king no longer had the power to veto acts of parliament, the governors of the royal colonies enjoyed this power as well as the rights to appoint and remove officials and grant pardons. The colonial assemblies, the lawmaking branches of government, were elected by popular vote in the citizens. There were many instances modeled after parliament and were charged with controlling their colonies' budgets and taxes. Virginia had the House of Burgesses, Maryland had delegates, Massachusetts called them representatives. The main qualification for voting is if a person owned property, which women, Native Americans, African Americans could not own land at this time, so they were not eligible to vote. During the English Civil War from 1642 to 1651, colonial administration was kind of fell by the wayside. Obviously wasn't a priority. And so the colonists kind of experienced a period of semi-independent rule. There was also a strong theme of mercantilism in the colonies, again, stronger in some areas than others. But in the mercantile system is an economic system meant to increase the nation's wealth through government regulation of all the nation's commercial interests, such as trading, manufacturing, selling goods, etc. So, again, a lot of the colonies were established as a way to gain resources for England. The colonies provided silver, gold, and raw materials such as fur, fish, timber, sugar, tobacco, indigo, tar, etc. And that England needed to supply food, build ships, and produce goods. They were also held in a captive market, so the colonial consumers were forced to buy goods created in the home country, in this case, England. So they provided the raw materials. England, in turn, provided the goods, and the colonists were just kind of forced to buy the goods that England provided for them. The English colonies in America were also used as a way to relieve social tensions. Again, we talked about the Puritans being able to escape religious persecution by moving to the United States. Also, some were kind of forced to come here, such as prisoners were sent down to Georgia, specifically debtors who were imprisoned because they owed a debt. So it was a place to kind of absorb the persecuted, the poor, unemployed, and imprisoned. So the English kind of looked at the colonies as a resource, a way to gain resources, a way to send kind of the quote unquote undesirables over to them, and they allowed them their own independent rule for the most part. Again, depending on which king or queen was on the throne at the time. We're going to learn about more in the next presentation how King George's, specifically his policies and taxes, led the colonists to flat out declare independence. So I hope that helped you with your study guide and helped you get an overview of how English government affected the colonial ideas on government. Again, you don't have to write all of that down. I try to give you quite a bit of detail to give you a good overview of English history and how it led to the colonies' government. But do please write down some of the main ideas if you did not get them from each other's presentations. And also make sure that you know how these various events and ideas led to the colonists' ideas. All right, thank you.